All right. Well, we finished off World War II last class period. So now we're going to kind of dive into the Holocaust itself. This is one of the things that we do with this unit. I've kind of pulled the Holocaust out and put it at the end because that's kind of the time in which most Americans found out about all the atrocities and things that went on. We knew about the Nuremberg laws and some of the lead up to this, but we really didn't know the depth and the extent of it. We had intelligence who had gotten some rumors and some ideas and stories, but it was almost too unbelievable. And it wasn't until we actually liberated a lot of these camps and came into contact with them in Germany and Poland that we really figured out the extent of what had happened. So, kind of the same way, we take you guys through World War II, and then just like the American people, you kind of find out more about it at the end. But the big thing I want you to take from this is this was systematic. A lot of times people associate the Holocaust with just the death camps or stuff at the very end of this, but this was a systematic process. We're going to go ahead and start as far back as 1933, right after Hitler had taken power. One of the first things that he does is he passes a law that says that all non-Aryans be removed from government jobs, which primarily was targeting the Jewish people. Now, first, this seems small. Very few Jewish people actually served in government. This was part of his Germany for Germans mentality that most of the country rallied around. What's the big deal? What's the big harm that Germans can't participate in the democracy, participate in the government itself if they are Jewish, if they are non-Aryans, non-Germans in Hitler's eyes? So he starts small. And then 2 years later, the Nazis passed the Nuremberg laws, which begins to take away some property rights, certain other jobs, and then most importantly, it takes away citizenship rights from the Jewish people. And if you take away your citizenship rights, you're taking away your right to a fair trial, your right to an attorney, your right to free speech, and those types of things. Once again, sounds rather small on the surface. This is part of that Germany for Germans mentality. He says these people are not German, therefore they should not be German citizens. The other thing that's probably quite ironic out of all of this is they also pass a law that all Jewish people must wear the Star of David on their clothing. So in essence, he's saying, these Jewish people are so not like us. They are so beneath us, so Untermenschen, lesser people, that we definitely need to discriminate against them. And oh yes, by the way, do you mind wearing the star on your outfit so that we can tell you apart? You're so different than us that we need you to identify yourself so we know that you're not like us. Now, people ask all the time, how would they know who's Jewish, who's not? Can people just not wear the star? Beyond the fact that at that time period, especially, Jewish people married other Jewish people 99% of the time. They did have certain ethnic characteristics and physical characteristics that you could identify with. They had similar last names. If your last name was Berkowitz or something, pretty good indication that you were Jewish. But beyond that, Jewish people belonged to synagogues, and synagogues had rosters and records of who was members of each synagogue, and so there are public records there. The government, every time you fill out a tax form, you identify your religion or ethnicity. Same thing with census data. So the government had plenty of records. Could you get by possibly not wearing it? Possibly. But the punishment was extremely severe, jail, even possible death. So was it worth the risk? Then, step by step, this thing accelerates. 3 years later, Kristallnacht takes place. This is the night of broken glass. Hitler sends in his Nazi stormtroopers into Jewish neighborhoods. They start riots. They attack businesses, destroy homes. And then they blame it on the Jewish people because the Germans and the Nazis control all the news and the radio. They announced that this civil unrest and these protests had happened in Jewish neighborhoods, and the Nazis simply came in and restored order. 100 Jews are killed in the process, and 30,000 are arrested. He blames it all on the Jews. And it's by this point, we're still a year away from this war ever starting. At this point, Hitler's still a guy with some crazy ideas, but he's rebuilding the German economy, giving them pride in themselves, what have you. So Jewish people do eventually start to see the writing on the wall that this is escalating, and most of them do flee. That's the other question I get asked a lot. Why didn't they just leave? Well, a lot of them do leave. Now, it's not very simple to do so. You're moving to other countries where you don't speak the language. And the problem is that they do leave, but they go to Poland, they go to Belgium, they go to Austria, they go to France, all places that within the next year to 2 years, Germany will take over. And all those people who fled will find themselves back under Nazi occupation again. Now, why didn't they come to America? Well, if you remember from our previous units, the National Origins Act was in existence. Americans were very intolerant, and we didn't want 4 million Jewish people flooding into the United States at that time either. And so we didn't let very many Jewish people immigrate to the United States either. Plus, Hitler made it pretty difficult for Germans to make this decision. They basically fleeced them on their way out the door. If Jewish people were to leave Germany, he would allow it, but they had to pay this year's taxes and next year's taxes before leaving, plus had to forfeit 90% of their assets. So you have these people who'd been doctors and lawyers and professionals and bankers and had built up wealth and assets and retirement. And now they're deciding to leave, and they basically have to give it all up and then go to a country whose language they don't speak and start completely over again. So Jewish people waited a long time because you don't want to flee and then somebody assassinates Hitler, everything goes back to normal, and you just gave up everything. Germany basically steals all this Jewish property and use it to pay for the war. It's estimated that the Jewish property paid for about 30% of Germany's war costs, just the stuff they stole from the Jewish people when they left. And it wasn't just Jewish people. They also rounded up gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, mentally ill, handicapped, political prisoners, etc. into these camps. But by the time World War II starts, there are only 250,000 Jewish people left in Germany. But 6 million more will wind up under German occupation by the time the war gets going. So this is that slow escalation. Then when the war actually breaks out, Hitler goes ahead and arrests the rest of those Jewish people and put them into labor camps. And the Jewish people are put into ghettos in places like Warsaw, Poland, where they are crowded into apartment complexes surrounding factories, put under guard, and they're working in the armaments industry for free. And as the Nazis take over more and more territory and round up more and more Jewish people, those numbers grow. And eventually, the number of Jewish people in German control outnumber the number of people needed in the factories. And when that happens, Germany decides to stop feeding them very well, stop keeping them alive, essentially allowing disease to ravage through the camps. And as people became starved to death, as people died of disease, as people were murdered by these camp commandants, they would bring in new, healthier Jewish people. And then eventually those numbers got to the point where by 1943-44, they came up with the final solution, as the Nazi memorandum stated it, to the Jewish question, where they started to build death camps to get rid of those who are no longer physically beneficial to the war effort, that productivity was too low. And so they began shipping Jewish people into the camps, and then pulling the ones from the camps that were no longer able to work, putting them on trains and sending them to the death camps, the places like Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz, as being the most famous. There, they would then execute people by the thousands. If you've ever seen the movie Schindler's List, I would encourage watching it. It's an Academy Award-winning movie made several decades ago, but it's a true story, and it does a really good job of showing this systematic escalation in the Holocaust. At the height, camps like Auschwitz could kill 12,000 people a day. And so essentially what Hitler and the Nazis end up on as their means of executing people is the gas chamber. And so they would bring in trains, load up all these sick, weak, disease-ridden people from these labor camps, put them on trains, send them to Auschwitz. They would get to Auschwitz. The sign above Auschwitz says, "Work will set you free." and they convince them that they're being sent to a new labor camp. They tell them that, hey, we're going to give you a shower. Most of them hadn't been allowed to shower in months, sometimes years. And so they say, hey, take your clothes off, fold them real neatly, put them on the table here so you can get them when you come back. And they usher them into giant shower rooms, seal the door. Those Jewish people who came in who were healthy enough to be of use were sent to go collect the clothes, box them up, and they would put them on trains to ship back to the camps to be reused. Once all these other prisoners are in these gas chambers, these shower rooms, they pumped an industrialized rat poison known as Zyklon B into the room. Zyklon B was a rat poison, and all rat poisons, the actual poison is odorless. Every rat poison puts in an indicator, another chemical into the mix that has the odor, has the scent, the thing that makes it smell really, really bad. That way, if any human comes into contact with the rat poison, starts to breathe even a whiff of it, they're going to try not to breathe it and get away from it because it smells so bad. Well, when they made Zyklon B without the indicator, it was odorless. And so they would start pumping the gas through those shower heads and kill everybody in the room. Then those Jewish people who came in on the trains who were still healthy enough to be of use were then tasked to drag the bodies out of the shower room and bring them to the crematorium you see in the top right picture, where the bodies were incinerated. Oftentimes, small children, infants, basically, they would just take them straight to the ovens without even going through the gas chamber process because they couldn't fight back. So pretty gruesome all around there. And honestly, that wasn't even some of the most gruesome stuff. Nazi doctors had a field day with using humans as experiments. All the experiments that they had always wanted to do with humans but couldn't, now they had Jewish subjects to use for these experiments. Twins especially were valuable because they were a great control group. They would try out organ transplant treatments, and if the subjects died, oh well, they would grab some more from the camps. They would try out different ways to rewarm bodies that had hypothermia. They would experiment with them in all kinds of different ways, trying out different medications and chemicals and drugs, and just witnessing the effects on actual humans that they had gotten from these concentration camps. Joseph Mengele, the most famous Nazi doctor that ran a lot of these experiments. This video here is going to talk about more of that.
Deep into the atrocities committed by the Third Reich, we'll be exploring the evil lengths to which Nazi Germany went in their inhumane scientific endeavors.
Deep into the atrocities committed by the Third Reich, we'll be exploring the evil lengths to which Nazi Germany went in their inhumane scientific endeavors.
They were gassed,
Number
shot,
5, they used prisoners
hanged,
for
and then
incendiary bomb
burned.
research.
Men, women, children, babies.
Number 5, they used prisoners for incendiary bomb research.
Everyone deserves what he gets. These words will never, ever leave my memory.
The concentration camps operated by the Nazis will forever be remembered as one of the most shameful displays of human cruelty in history. Starvation, forced labor, physical abuse, and the risk of execution were all daily realities in the camps. But at Buchenwald, prisoners were also used as guinea pigs for research. Among the most notorious were the incendiary experiments carried out between 1943 and 1944. These experiments involved intentionally exposing prisoners to severe white phosphorus burns in order to better understand the nature of the wounds caused by incendiary bombs, as well as evaluate their effectiveness of various treatments. White phosphorus, if you're wondering, results in chemical burns capable of eating down to the bone. Number 4, they conducted survival experiments.
On the average, we would dispatch 2,000 people a day.
There will always be those who seek to push the human body to its limits, like real-life Iceman Wim Hof, who trained himself to survive extreme cold. The key distinction here is that he willfully subjected his body to such trials. Testing the resilience of a human body without consent, however, is torture, and that's just what the Nazis did. In Dachau, the scientists purposefully froze Jewish and Russian prisoners to the point where they passed out or died to better educate themselves on cold weather before pushing the Eastern Front. They also studied the effects of being at high altitudes using pressured chambers, as well as trying to make seawater drinkable, both of which reportedly killed most subjects. Number 3, prisoners were intentionally exposed to disease.
They performed experiments, painful often, on the children consigned to death.
Why would they do such a thing? Well, scientists of the Third Reich clearly weren't exactly concerned with their morality or ethics and saw their prisoner populations as opportunities to study infectious illnesses in a controlled environment in order to develop treatments. The various experiments were carried out in both the aforementioned Dachau and Buchenwald concentration camps, as well as Sachsenhausen, Natzweiler, and Neuengamme. To be clear, they weren't interested in finding a cure for the common cold. The inoculations included such deadly diseases as epidemic jaundice or infectious hepatitis, tuberculosis, malaria, typhoid fever, yellow fever, and typhus, and unsurprisingly claimed countless lives. Number 2, Dr. Mengele and the terror of twins. If there's one evil Nazi scientist whose name has etched its way into the mainstream, it's Dr. Josef Mengele. An SS officer, Mengele was one of the leading medical minds of the Third Reich. After having requested a transfer to a concentration camp, Mengele took up his post as chief physician of Auschwitz, where he sent thousands of prisoners to their death in the gas chambers. It was here that he performed his inhumane genetic experiments, including his research on twins. Amputations, intentional introduction of disease, and unnecessary blood transfusions were all just a few of the techniques he employed, and he reportedly even sewed 2 twins together. He was never captured.
Miriam would have been taken immediately to Mengele's lab, killed with a phenol injection to the heart, and then Mengele would have done the comparative autopsies.
Number 1, they tried to prove Jewish inferiority with the Jewish skeleton collection. Though the Nazi concept of purity led them to persecute many groups, including the disabled, homosexuals, people of color, Slavics, Roma gypsies, and more, the Jews were the primary target. So strong were the anti-Semitic views that an anatomist at the Reich University of Strasbourg, August Hirt, actually developed a project known as the Jewish Skeleton Collection in order to scientifically validate the eugenic effort of the regime. The collection claimed 115 victims, most of whom were selected for their stereotypically Jewish features, of which 86 were chosen to serve as part of the finished collection. The bodies were to be dissected, studied, and ultimately preserved as skeletons, but thankfully the course of the war changed and Hirt committed suicide.
And, the doctor stuff was just, some of the many, almost satanic things that the Nazis did. There's videos of them stringing, instead of having mattresses on the bed, they just strung barbed wire. And so the camp members could sleep on beds of barbed wire rather than sleep on mattresses. Why? No real purpose. There's a famous example, too, with a cattle car full of people that rolled up to one of the concentration camps about the same time the Allies were closing in. And so the German officers at the camp just fled. They fled the camp, didn't even unpack the train in the middle of winter. And by the time the Allies got to the camp to liberate it, they checked the train and thousands of bodies had frozen to death in the train itself because they were trapped, they were locked, they had nowhere to go, and it was the middle of winter. So as a result of all of this, the Allies decide that the actions of the Nazis are well beyond what is considered to be acceptable in warfare. The phrase "all is fair in love and war," they said this is well beyond that. And so we hold the Nuremberg War Crimes Trial, one of the first times in world history in which we actually put the leaders of a enemy on trial for the things that they did during warfare. And so 21 of the highest-ranking German officers who survived, because Himmler, Goebbels, Hitler, of course, all committed suicide, but 21 of the other highest-ranking Nazi leaders are put on trial. And they have a Russian, a French, and a British judge in charge of the trial. They have attorneys presented. They bring Jewish prisoners and other witnesses to describe the things that went on in this Nazi regime. They allow these people to get up and testify for themselves. And almost to a man, they said they were just following orders. In the end, the judge and the court find 12 of them guilty and sentenced to death, 9 others sentenced to various years in prison. famously Werner von Braun, a Nazi scientist who was was working on the atomic bomb, built the rockets and jet propulsion, doesn't get put in jail. Instead, he gets sent to the United States and given a job and put in charge of our eventual space program. Hermann Goering, the next in line to Hitler throughout the war, is sentenced to death, but he befriends an American guard and convinces that guard to bring him a cyanide tablet, and he commits suicide in his cell the night before he was to be hung. Alfred Speer, in charge of the German armaments industry, Karl Donitz, the head of the Navy, get 10, 20 years prison, respectively. And then 20,000 other Nazi leaders are also convicted in smaller trials throughout Germany after the war as well. These are, the camp commandants of these concentration camps, in some cases guards that carried out certain orders, etc. Because of the way the Japanese had attacked and taken over, the rape of Nanking and the things they had done in China and around the globe, the Bataan Death March and things, the 7 highest-ranking Japanese leaders were also put on trial in the Tokyo War Crimes trial, and all 7 of those were sentenced to death. So when this is officially over, we decide not to make the same mistakes that we made in World War I. World War I, the Allies won, and they decided to stick it to the losers. And it created this chaotic situation, this global depression that led to an even worse war. So after World War II, we decided to do the opposite. The United States will spend $21 billion rebuilding Western Europe and Japan. $13 billion in Western Europe, $9 billion in Japan. We will actually occupy Japan for 9 years after World War II is over. General Douglas MacArthur basically stays in Japan and rules it almost as a territorial governor. They still have their emperor, who's still there in the imperial palace, but MacArthur basically runs Japan for about 9 years as we rebuild their economy. We take war companies like Mitsubishi and Nissan, who were making tanks and guns and bombs before the war, and got them making appliances and cars and motorcycles and those types of things to make money instead. So we rebuilt their economy so the people weren't desperate. MacArthur also writes the Japanese Constitution for them and basically just has them sign it. One of the key things in there, it still says to this day that Japan can have no armed forces other than that of self-defense. So basically Japan to this day has no more military. If anything happens, the United States is there to protect them. So the legacy, the lasting impact, and this is kind of important here. The lasting impact of World War II, 4 big bullet points. Number 1, it began the Cold War. The Soviet Union never really trusted the Allies. They understood they were communist, we were capitalist. And so the feud between us and them starts almost immediately. We'll talk about that a lot more in our next unit. Number 2 is the dawn of the nuclear age. Once Harry Truman makes the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan, it's out there. You can't undo it. People know it's possible. People want it. And so even to this day, we're still dealing with this. We just finished the Iraq War that happened within your lifetime. That was mostly because we were afraid that Saddam Hussein was making atomic weapons. And so that fear is out there, that fear that North Korea is going to build or has nuclear weapons, the fear that Iran has nuclear weapons. It's still there. It will persist always. The fear that some rogue person will detonate a nuclear bomb in an American city and kill millions of people is still there. We start test detonating nuclear weapons in the 1950s like they're firecrackers. We detonate hundreds of nuclear weapons in the 1950s between the two of us until we realize the effects that radiation has, and then we kind of stop atmospheric testing. By the 1960s, we have thousands of nuclear bombs. And, the Soviet Union only has 850. Well, yeah, that's great. We have lots more, but if they blow up 600, 700 American cities, did we really win? So we reached that mutual assured destruction stage by the 1960s, where if there is a nuclear war between our two countries, we're both going to lose. Third bullet point here is the birth of superpowers. Historically, forever, and you had a lot of major countries. Ever since the fall of the Roman Empire, you had Germany as a powerful country, Italy as a powerful country, Great Britain as a powerful country, the United States as a powerful country, Russia as a powerful country, China as a powerful country, Japan as a powerful country, Spain as a powerful country. All these countries all roughly at the same level. After World War II, all of those countries dropped a notch because they were devastated by this war. They were devastated by Nazi occupation. They were bankrupted by fighting it, whatever, except for the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union's military was as large as it had ever been. An industry was cranking at a rate that it had never seen. They took a step up. The United States did the exact same. The Great Depression is now over. We actually have two militaries basically now, one for the West Coast, one for the East Coast, and we take a step forward as well. And so for the first time in about 700 years, the two most dominant countries in the world were not in Europe. That non-European powers now dominated the political scene, and they had two completely polar opposite views upon the world. Us with freedom and capitalism and democracy, and the Soviet Union with fairness and communism, just totally different ways to look at the world, which is going to become important with the fourth bullet point. Since Columbus in 1492, European countries had colonized Africa and Asia and South America. And that had been the case from about 1500 to 1950. That's a long time. That's 400 years, dang near, of these people being subjugated by European powers. After 400 years, you kind of believe that's just the way things are supposed to be. And people had become accepting of this European dominance, exploitation. And then in comes Japan. And an Asian country was kicking the butt of a bunch of European and Western countries. And although these colonies hated the Japanese because they treated them even worse than the British or the French or the Americans did, they still saw Asians defeating Europeans. And so when this war is over, a lot of these colonies are going to have a really hard time going back to being subjugated, going back to being colonies again. And you see independence movements break out all throughout Asia, all throughout South America, all throughout Africa after World War II. If you look in those three places where most of their countries gained their independence, it's going to be from 1945 to 1975. Now, a lot of them had to fight for it, but they eventually get it. And that's going to become important because you're going to bring 40, 50 new countries onto the world map, and they're going to pick, am I going to be communist or am I going to be democratic? Am I going to be capitalist or am I going to be communist? They're going to have to make that decision. Do I seek help from the United States or from the Soviet Union? And that is important because Joseph Stalin says a war between us and the Soviet Union is inevitable. Well, if that's the case, we don't want to sit around and let the communists gain all of these countries to their side of the equation. Don't let the Middle East become communist. If the Middle East became communist, there goes one of the largest supplies of oil in the world. And then if this inevitable war happens and the communists control all the oil, good luck fighting an industrial war with tanks and planes and guns and boats and all this stuff if you don't have any oil resources. So the United States becomes very hyper aware of what's going on around the world. So this basically ends here, our last stuff here on World War II. Last thing I'll leave you with is this chart here that shows the firepower versus the number of people needed. And it's a kind of a disturbing trend here. Historically, from Cain and Abel, the amount of firepower versus the number of people involved, pretty much a linear graph. Side by side, one person, two fists, slightly more firepower than people. Then you get to clubs, then bows and arrows, then even guns. And the amount of firepower goes up a little bit, but it still takes roughly more people to get to more firepower. Then you get into the 20th century, and you start getting cannons, and all of a sudden the firepower goes up quite a bit, but it still takes more cannons to get much more firepower. Then you get to World War II, and you got planes and bombs, but it still takes a lot of bombs and a lot of planes with a lot of crew members to do a lot of damage. Then you hit the nuclear age and the end of World War II. And now one bomb can blow up an entire city with one flight crew. And the firepower it takes to do destruction continues to go up as bombs and nuclear bombs get more and more powerful. And the number of people needed to do this goes down. And that's a scary thing, because now if one rogue it's tough to find a country full of crazy people willing to fight a war. It's a lot easier to find a handful of crazy people willing to do stuff. This is where we see in modern warfare now, we're not so much worried about countries anymore. Tough to find entire countries willing to go to war and sacrifice and fight. But we're fighting small terrorist groups who are doing immense amount of damage. We had 9 people on airplanes, 9 hijackers, kill thousands of people in 9/11. Just a small group of people, lots of firepower. And it's a scary thing for society when a smaller group can do even more damage. But anyway, that's the end of this unit. And so I'll give you some time to work on study guides here.